All right, so we're going to pick up where we left off in the previous practice with our app component rendering a bunch of joke components. Some of these have the punchline in them, and some of them have a question and punchline. But you can see right now that they're hard-coded into our components, written directly as text. In reality, most of the data that you'll be displaying on a page will actually be coming from some kind of HTTP call to an API, where there's a server that hosts a database, and that database and server are returning JSON data to you. We haven't quite gotten to the place where we can make API calls quite yet. So what I've done is I've made this file jokesdata.js, and it's just an array variable that I'm exporting. And that way in a component, if we want it, we can pull that in and pretend like that's us getting data from an API. So how am I going to take an array of raw data and turn that into a number of components? Well, there's a common saying for those that are learning React where they say that React helps them become better JavaScript developers. And the reason is because things like this are oftentimes handled by methods and kind of magic under the hood for other frameworks like Angular or Vue. But in React, a lot of these simple operations are handled just with vanilla JavaScript. Let me show you what I mean with a quick aside. We're going to talk about some higher order array methods. If you're not familiar with these are methods that you can run on an array that take a function as a parameter and allow you, the developer, to decide exactly what should happen to the elements in that array. For example, if I had the following array, I can run a higher order method on nums called map. And map is a method of the nums array, and it takes a function as its parameter. This function will receive each individual number in the array. So I might say num or number, say num. This function will then run on every single item in the array. And with map, whatever I return from my inner function here will be placed in the same index of a brand new array with some kind of modification, meaning map actually returns a brand new array. So I'm going to save a new array called maybe doubled. Now, if I, from my inner function, return num times 2, doubled should be an array of 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and so on. Let's take a look. And there's my array of all the doubled numbers. If you're not familiar with higher order methods, they're one of the key components of functional programming in JavaScript, and they're really, really awesome. I'd highly recommend go study up a little bit on map and filter and reduce and some of the other ones that are really useful. For this, we're going to stick with map, and we're going to see what we can use it for. So the first thing I'm going to do is pull in my jokes data by importing it. And then we're going to follow the same pattern that we did in our example here. I'm going to say jokesdata.map and provide a function. Now before I typed the longhand function so that it was a little clear what I was doing, but we're going to use an arrow function, which can just as legitimately be used here. This function is going to receive each individual joke object, so I'll call it joke. And with arrow functions, if I just have one parameter, I can get rid of my parentheses. And what I'm going to return from this inner function isn't some modification on the joke object per se, but rather I'm going to return a component, joke component, and pass in the data from the individual joke object that I'm looking at. And because I'm only returning a single component, I can actually just do this on one line if I want. And if you're familiar with arrow functions, there's an implicit return, so I could actually get rid of some of that extra stuff. If this is confusing at all, then feel free to put the return in there. Looks like I have an extra space there. And remember, map returns a new array, so I'm going to save that in a variable. And now I have an array of components. So what am I going to do with an array of components? Well, React makes it really nice where I can just put an array of components directly here in my JSX. And if I refresh this, you'll notice a couple things. First of all, my jokes on the right are working again, just like they should be. And second of all, you might have noticed this little error that popped up that says each child in an array or iterator should have a key prop. We won't go too much into the details of why React expects a key prop on repeated components, but it's enough to know that whenever you're doing a map like this, you should give the component that you're creating over and over a new prop called key. Now, whether you're putting this on a component that you've created or some kind of div that you're surrounding it with, doesn't really matter. Just give it a key prop and put something unique inside the key prop. Usually data from an API will include some kind of ID number or something else that's unique about it. As long as it's unique, it should be fine. Here I could use the question because the questions are all unique. But I've also included, for the sake of mimicking real data, some ID numbers that I might decide to use instead for my key. So over in app.js, key is going to be joke.id. Now when I refresh, my warning goes away. My app.js is much cleaner than it used to be. My data is coming from somewhere external like it would in the real world. One of the main takeaways, though, is that we're just using the built-in JavaScript map method on arrays. In fact, I'm going to include some links to the MDN docs on these methods that will be really helpful for you to understand if you don't already feel comfortable with them. You can see on the far right in the last part of the URL exactly which method it is that this URL is going to be talking about. In this course, we'll mostly be using map, but we may throw in one of these other ones every now and then. You don't necessarily have to go memorize these perfectly right now, but this is just some more material that you'll definitely be interested in learning about. And something else that I just thought of that may be really helpful to you is to realize that the things that we're teaching here, because so much of React is just vanilla JavaScript, you can use these things as tools to do a lot of what your imagination could come up with. For example, as I'm iterating over a joke component and creating a number of jokes, I may find reason to also put a map inside of my joke component and I end up with a loop inside of a loop where each joke component renders an array of its own components. That's totally possible, and it's as simple as putting another map inside of your joke component. One joke component gets rendered, it renders a number of other components. The second joke component gets rendered, it also renders a number of other components, and so forth. Some of these other methods, like sort, for example, can be used to put things in an order that you prefer. Or something like filter could only display certain elements of an array rather than the entire array. If you want an extra challenge, try making it so that our array of joke components gets filtered to only display those that have fewer than X number of characters in the question. Or maybe filtered to only include items that do have a question rather than those that are just an answer. This is pretty much everything we have to learn about map right now. So when you feel pretty comfortable with this, go to the next lesson to practice it.